The Tsarist Empire at the turn of the 20th century was a giant with feet of clay. Spanning from Central Europe to the Kamchatka Peninsula in East Asia, its size overshadowed the fact that it was mostly an agrarian country where a few rich people lived grandiose lifestyles while the masses experienced complete poverty. Its lack of industrial development relative to Western European countries was compensated instead by a massive advantage in manpower. While the need for reform was well understood around the year 1900, the measures that the political elite took were too little, too late. In 1914, when the First World War started, the empire performed poorly. Sustaining many casualties, the country was weakened and becoming unstable. Meanwhile, a movement that had existed underground for many years took advantage of the situation. The communist movement was fueled by dissatisfaction with a system that privileged the few, while the masses seemed destined to continue living in poverty. The pace of reform was too slow, and many people felt that a revolution was needed. Some became attracted to the communist ideal of an egalitarian society. But the persecution that the Tsarist authorities applied to the communist movement meant that its numbers were small, with many having been imprisoned or having to flee abroad. Their moment came in October 1917, when, taking advantage of the weakened Tsarist state, under the leadership of the charismatic Vladimir Lenin, they started a revolution, managing to kill the ruling Romanov family and seize power. For the next 5 years, the country would be in a civil war which ended with a complete victory of the communists. Thus, the Tsarist Empire became the Soviet Union. Its borders were relatively unchanged, with a few exceptions like the loss of Poland, Bessarabia, and the Baltic territories, which became independent. The political system, however, couldn't be more different. Soon after taking control of the country, Lenin became ill, and it was clear that he was unable to rule and would die shortly. The competition for his replacement mostly involved communist intellectuals like Leon Trotsky, but to everyone's surprise, it was someone else who outsmarted them all. Iosif Zhugashvili, better known as Joseph Stalin, was a Georgian communist appreciated for his practical skills, but underestimated by the party elite because he did not have a good education. That proved to be a major mistake because Stalin was intelligent and cunning. From the position of party secretary, Stalin ruled the Soviet Union for the next 3 decades. His rule was often brutal, with political opponents being exterminated and individuals suspected of dissent, such as many military officers inherited from the Tsarist era, being purged. Many innocent people uninvolved in politics suffered and died as a result of his policies. One of the most infamous policies of the 1930s in the Soviet Union was the collectivization of agriculture. Initiated on the premise that individual property was immoral and that wealthy peasants, known as kulaks, exploited the land's resources while the poor suffered, the Communist Party, under Stalin's leadership, began seizing land, animals, and tools from individuals to create collective farms. The peasants that opposed collectivizations were often executed or sent to gulags. This initiative resulted in a catastrophe. With cereal production plummeting, Stalin prioritized feeding the urban population working in industry, leading to the confiscation of the meager food reserves of the peasants. Millions are estimated to have perished, particularly in regions like Ukraine, the Russian Kuban, the southern Urals, and Kazakhstan. Despite the immense human cost, Stalin remained indifferent to the suffering caused by his policies. His unwavering commitment to creating a socialist society led him to justify the sacrifices people had to endure. Stalin's elimination of approximately 80 to 90% of military officers is believed to have contributed to the Soviet army's poor performance at the outset of World War II. While some attribute this to his paranoia, the true motivations behind his actions remain unclear. We must be mindful whenever we hear that Stalin was paranoid that there were numerous assassination attempts at his life. His vigilance could to a high degree be seen as justified rather than irrational. On the other hand, despite the brutality of his policies, they did succeed in building a strong and technologically advanced industry. While Stalin lacked a formal education, he was a constant learner. Through the course of his life, he would amass a library containing thousands of volumes. When he encountered new problems to which he couldn't make an informed decision because he had no knowledge of the subject, he would dwell on reading and self-educating himself about that subject. Thus, he often made mistakes at first, but learned on the spot. A critical test for both him and Soviet society arose in 1941 when Nazi Germany invaded. It was a fight for survival, with the Nazis aiming to exterminate the various peoples residing in the Soviet Union whom they deemed inferior. Initially, Soviet Russia struggled in the war, losing significant territory and facing German forces at the gates of Stalingrad, Leningrad, and Moscow. However, several factors began to favor the Soviets. The unusually harsh winter benefited them, the US provided crucial supplies to prevent a collapse, and the Union's populace mobilized on a massive scale, realizing the stakes of defeat. By April 1945, Soviet forces had reached Berlin. The triumph in what the people of the former Soviet Union referred to as the Great Patriotic War marked the peak of Soviet and Russian power. Russia, lacking natural boundaries like major rivers or mountains, historically felt insecure and sought to expand its borders southward. This expansionist mindset influenced the Soviet leaders in negotiating new boundaries from a position of strength as victors. Territories were annexed, including Bessarabia from Romania, the eastern part of Poland, the Baltic states, and the establishment of satellite states along the western frontier to create a buffer zone against adversaries. The Soviet sphere of influence extended beyond Berlin. Despite significant damage to Soviet infrastructure post-World War II, the subsequent years witnessed a rapid recovery. By acquiring nuclear weapons in 1949, the Soviet Union, at the time of Stalin's death, had emerged as a global superpower, second only to the United States of America in terms of influence and capabilities. The Soviet Union of the 1950s possessed everything a country could desire: 1/6 of the Earth's total landmass, abundant natural resources, a large and youthful population, and a string of satellite states forming the Warsaw Pact strictly under its control. The future appeared promising, but one factor threatened to undermine it all: the rigid communist ideology. Communism views private property as a sin, considering private businesses a means of exploiting workers for the benefit of greedy businessmen. The proposed solution to perceived injustices in the capitalist system is for individuals to collectively own all means of production. While this concept may seem appealing, the practical implementation of the communist system reveals critical flaws that lead to disastrous outcomes. First is poor resource allocation. In a capitalist economy, the market operates based on the laws of supply and demand. When demand exceeds supply, prices rise, incentivizing investment to match supply with demand. The communists rejected market mechanisms, allowing the party to dictate prices for goods and determine how much investment each sector received. This approach proved inefficient as it lacked the self-regulatory nature of the market, leading to poor investments, particularly favoring heavy industries over consumer goods. Low productivity is also a crucial flaw. In a capitalist system, entrepreneurs are motivated to run profitable and efficient businesses because it is in their interest for their business to succeed. In contrast, the communist system does not offer incentives for people. The slogan "from each according to their ability to each according to their needs" often resulted in equal rewards to both the lazy and the hardworking. Also, the absence of inner company competition due to state monopolies created no incentive for innovation. The policymakers realized that the Soviet economy lagged behind the Western capitalist economies. But every reform that they implemented failed to have a substantial impact because they did not deal with the cause of the problems: the communist ideology. In 1953, Stalin died, leading to a power struggle. The top pretenders were Georgy Malenkov, Lavrenti Beria, and Nikita Khrushchev. Khrushchev emerged victorious and replaced Stalin. One of his most notable actions was his denunciation of Stalin's oppressive regime and the implementation of measures to promote a more humane style of governance. But Khrushchev also faced failures, especially in managing the economy and foreign policy, which prompted the party leaders to oust him from power in 1964. In his place, Leonid Brezhnev was chosen. His rule was characterized by stability, but his period would ultimately be known as the era of stagnation because he rejected any major reforms. While the Soviet population generally liked him for providing stability and investing in various social programs, he ultimately failed as a leader because he proved incapable to deal with his country's underlying problems. As he grew older, his health declined, leading to a collective leadership style. But those with whom he shared power were mostly old as well and resistant to change. After Brezhnev's death in 1982, a shift in the leadership occurred. Rather than being replaced by a traditional party bureaucrat, Yuri Andropov, a longtime member of the KGB, was selected as his successor. Prior to becoming first secretary, Andropov served as chairman of KGB since 1967, and throughout his career, he distinguished himself as an intelligent and disciplined individual. His pragmatic approach to solving issues meant that he was not blinded by the communist dogma. But luck would not be on the Soviet side, as Andropov suffered from health issues which worsened after he took power. He died after only 15 months as general secretary, and his reforms aimed at combating corruption and nepotism remained unrealized. Andropov's early death was surprising, as no successor was prepared, so the leadership had to act quickly in order to ensure stability. Konstantin Chernenko, the man to replace Andropov, is probably the least known Soviet leader. He was chosen because, as a long-time member of the Communist Party and a representative of the old guard of Soviet leadership, Chernenko would ensure continuity and stability. But Chernenko also had health issues and was quite old. His capacity to govern was limited, and only 13 months after taking office, he died on March 10, 1985. By the 1980s, the country was increasingly indebted, stuck in a war in Afghanistan, and spending a huge amount of its GDP on its military to ensure parity with the US, which had a much larger economy. It was after Chernenko's death that a man who understood the problems facing the Soviet Union and was committed to bring the necessary reforms took power. An optimist by nature, he seemed the perfect choice to save the country, but ultimately his reforms came too late, and the naive manner in which they were implemented only accelerated up what became inevitable: total collapse. Mikhail Gorbachev was the first Soviet ruler who did not fight in World War II. A highly educated man and a former protégé of Yuri Andropov, he represented a new generation of leaders that possessed the energy and vision for the future that the older guard lacked. The two key policies designed to bring reform were called glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring. Glasnost aimed to introduce transparency and openness in the government by reducing censorship and allowing for freedom of expression. Perestroika sought to restructure the economy through privatization, decentralization, and the introduction of market mechanisms. Gorbachev reduced the central government's control, allowing for more decision-making at regional levels. His policies were intended to reform the top of the political system, with the expectation that the effects would gradually trickle down to lower levels, thus modernizing the entire society. However, it was a losing bet. The previous rulers had good reasons to govern with an iron fist. The Soviet Union faced many underlying economic, social, and ethnic problems that had been kept under check only by strict centralized control. Once that iron grip was loosened, the underlying issues began to surface. Various peoples, such as those in the Baltic states, who had never been asked to join the Union but had been annexed, expressed a desire for independence. The societies in the Warsaw Pact satellite states were dissatisfied with the communist system and yearned for prosperity similar to that of the West. As a result, everything began to crumble. Gorbachev was not a tough, ruthless leader. He accepted the desires of the European satellites to embrace a Western system. When the Soviet Union started to disintegrate, he preferred to avoid bloodshed and let the will of the people prevail. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed, with the Russian Federation recognized as its lawful successor. At the same time, on its eastern border, China was also undergoing reform. Mao's successor, Deng Xiaoping, chose a different path. Instead of starting with political reform, he maintained authoritarian control over society while implementing economic reforms. Private initiatives were permitted and foreign investment was gradually allowed into the country. While these reforms were clearly in contradiction to communist ideology, Deng Xiaoping was a pragmatist interested in practical results. He characterized his measures as representing communism with Chinese characteristics. As a result, China experienced the most impressive economic rise the world has ever seen, all while the Chinese Communist Party remained firmly in power. China serves as proof that the Soviet Union might not have been destined for collapse. If its leaders had been more ideologically flexible, like the Chinese leaders after Mao's death, the story of the Soviet Union could have unfolded differently. The Soviet history is ultimately about failure, but it is important to remember that this failure came only because of the flawed socio-economic system that hindered the great potential of the Soviet people. This potential sometimes manifested itself, and the world was surprised with its results. The best example is the Soviet space exploration program, which one could argue achieved more than the US counterpart. The disappearance of the Soviet Union was perceived differently by people around the world. The Western world saw it as a good event, marking the end of a scary period known as the Cold War, and serving as justification that the capitalist, democratic societies are a superior way of organizing a society. People that live in the former Soviet satellites, namely Poland, former Eastern Germany, Hungary, former Czechoslovakia, Romania, and Bulgaria, also were happy that their countries had the freedom to pursue the Western system and become more prosperous. In the former Soviet Union, the perception is mixed. While in the Baltic countries the overwhelming majority welcomed their freedom, many ex-Soviet states experienced hard times following the collapse of their former homeland. Their economies crumbled, leading to a huge spike in poverty. Local wars ensued, leading to death and suffering. Many older people still are nostalgic for the times when they were once part of the great Soviet Union. They had stability and peace. It was also a tragedy for the ethnic Russians. Millions of them overnight found themselves becoming a minority in an ex-Soviet state. While for the ones that ended up within the boundaries of the Russian Federation, they had to go through hard times in the 1990s. With a collapsing economy, they remained only with the memories of once being a great superpower.